I want to talk this morning about the difference between ultimate and relative bodhicitta as presented in the Lojong. I could also say it's about the difference between mind and body. It's also about the difference between thought and action. And as you may know, Buddhism does not put a very big emphasis on drawing that distinction. For Buddhism, the mind-body problem, which is what we call it here in the West, doesn't exist. They solve the mind-body problem by ignoring it, which I think is perfectly acceptable. So I was somewhat surprised when I found in the Lojong, particularly in the section on raising bodhicitta, that that distinction had definitely been drawn. There is a difference between ultimate and relative bodhicitta. And I discovered that the person who was primarily responsible for drawing that distinction was a monk in northern India at Nalanda Monastery, which was a monastic university, is what they referred to it as, in the 7th century. No, in the 8th century, by the name of Shanti Devi. Shanti Devi was a guy who was born in southern India and who went north to Bihar province, which is right on the border of Nepal, and became a member of the faculty at Nalanda. Now, Nalanda in the 8th century was a big deal, because it had, for one thing, an enormous library. It was said to be the biggest library outside of Alexander that existed. It was also a great center. It was a center that drew monks from all different regions of the world where Buddhism was practiced. So there were the university itself had a huge influence, primarily on Tibet, because most of Shanti Devi's teachings were carried to Tibet and highly revered. But he also had a big impact on Korea, on China, and on Japan, and Vietnam. But he was the first to see that while we may ignore the mind-body problem as Buddhists, at the same time there are occasions when it becomes important to see that distinction and to understand the importance of that distinction. It's just like everything else in Buddhism. It's yes and no. And Shanti Devi wrote a couple of works, but the most important one was called The Way of the Bodhisattva. It was also translated as The Way of Enlightenment. And that was sort of a forerunner and had a big influence on the Kadampa teachers, of whom Atisha was one, and Atisha is generally regarded as the guy who originated Lojong practice. That was in the 11th century, so 300 years after Shanti Devi. The distinctions that he was talking about in the 8th century came to fruition in the 11th century. So why is this distinction made? As the Lojong points out, the raising of bodhicitta has two aspects. First aspect is the intention to act for the benefit of others. The intention to act for the benefit of others. The second aspect is the actions themselves. That basically is the difference between ultimate and relative bodhicitta. Another way of putting that distinction is, first, the thought of compassion in meditation. And secondly, the demonstration of compassion in everyday life. So why is it important to draw that distinction? Well, I think one reason is that our actions can only be truly compassionate if we have first generated the intention to be compassionate. In our practice, we talk a lot about the consequences of our actions. But of even greater importance is that we talk about the implications of our intentions. And intentions in many ways are held to be of even greater consequence than our actions. It is just as important to think about love and compassion as it is to behave compassionately. One of the reasons for this is that our compassion should be all-encompassing. We need to have a compassionate attitude towards not only the members of our family and our friends, but we need to have compassion towards everyone else and everything else. The compassion that is talked about in the Lojong is all-encompassing, and it is directed in every direction, and it includes every dharma, every phenomenon. This, of course, is sort of reminiscent of Ken Wilber. And what does he call the different ranks?
Stages.
Well, he's talking about integration. You know, as we become more and more integrated, we reach out to more and more phenomena, more and more dharma.
Like mythic, rational.
Right.
There's different names for
Right.
them.
Well, this is in a sense a very radical, different way of thinking. And it requires us to reevaluate our own selfishness and our own self-centeredness. Compassion is not about suffering with others. It is the wish that you can be of benefit to others that is the key, the desire, the intention to be of benefit to others. That is the real key. And that, of course, is very much a part of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is the desire to become a Buddha. The manifestation of that process is compassion and the application of compassion in all of our activities. But compassionate action will only arise out of compassionate thoughts. And that is why Shanti Devi saw the distinction as being so important. Because thinking about compassion, meditating on compassion, desiring compassion, desiring to be compassionate, is a method of reversing our egocentric attitude. And when we reverse our egocentric attitude, we start treating others as equals. Good heavens. What a concept. Shanti Devi, as well as the Kadampa teachers, taught that the real issue here is not about gaining happiness. It is about not gaining happiness at the expense of others. That's the most important thing. Because, as Shanti Devi pointed out, hurting others is destructive of your own emotional stability. It leads to an impoverishment of your life. The only way you can change this is to wish for the happiness of others. I have recently been hearing in various forms this statement: I will sometimes be required to harm others for the sake of my self-preservation. That's a statement that I hear repeated by a lot of my friends who carry firearms for the protection of their life and property and the protection of their families. I hear this statement said by police departments these days. Have we all noticed how police departments have become militaristic? Instead of a service organization, they have become some sort of a punishment section. This society seems to be completely at ease with this statement. I find it to be somewhat problematic, because if we could reverse this attitude, if we could go back to the idea that we should be of service to other people, that we should be compassionate, that we should treat others as equal, it will not only be beneficial to other people, it'll vastly improve the character of our own lives. I think that all human beings have a tendency to value action over everything else. But as I said before, Buddhism sees the motives behind an action as being more important. The motive for our actions can essentially be broken down into a desire to help, or a desire to harm. I mean, It's a very simplistic division. But I make it in order to point out that both of those motives, the desire to help and the desire to harm, are generally run in a parallel course throughout the activities of our daily life. And they become very confused at times. It's difficult for us to determine whether we really want to help or whether we want to harm people by our actions. It's difficult for us to tell whether we want to help people or whether we want to promote our own happiness and reduce our own suffering. Those things are very difficult to distinguish sometimes. But at the same time, it's very important that we do know that, you see. Some of the events that have happened down in Albuquerque with the police department, as well as here in the in Santa Fe, illustrate that very well. I mean, of course, their first priority is to help people. But the way in which they do it generally has the opposite effect. So how do we make these distinctions? How do we do that? That's why we have this practice, isn't it? If we can sit down for at least 30 minutes a day, every day, and think about the consequences of our motives, and think about what we're doing and why we're doing it, we may succeed in increasing our happiness as well as the happiness of all other people. And this, I think, is the main teaching of the Lojong. So once we make the distinction between thought and action, and we spend some time thinking about it, then we can put it back together. And thought and action will once again correspond. Body and mind. So that's how I see the difference between ultimate and relative bodhicitta. Thanks.
Thank you.